For those of you who have been around for a while, I remember in the 80s and 90s a saying came into currency that it's Frank Sinatra's world. We just live in it. I never met Frank, so, but from what I heard, that was kind of it. The chairman of the board ran things. So that's where we are today. Quick segue to APIs. We're here at CloudEXPO, Internet of Things Expo, along with the DevOpsSummit. And what I've seen this week, and I mentioned before, was a lot more task models and use cases and all the great stuff we're going to do. But I believe that whether you're talking about cloud or extending things out, that the API is of absolute importance. And so that's the theme of this power panel, is it's an API world. We just live in it. So we'd like to welcome Ian Kahn, Esmeralda Swartz, Reggie Hutcherson, and Brian Harrington. And they have a combination, big companies and smaller companies, different viewpoints. So what I'd like to do first is just have you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your company and a quick overview of whether or not you agree with the statement that it's an API world. Ian?
Thank you, Roger. My name is Ian Kahn, and I represent a company called Solgenia. We are in cloud monetization, cloud management. I completely agree with the statement that it's an API world. In fact, I would say a large part of the cloud economy is going to be driven by APIs going forward. With the emergence of connected devices, whether it's IoT, what have you out there in terms of IoT, APIs are going to play a crucial part in connecting everything together, or a significant part of devices out there. So definitely yes.
I'm Esmeralda Swartz, and I'm with Ericsson. I would say that they're absolutely critical. I talked yesterday about the need to put interconnectivity in IoT, and it's really about making it possible to connect everything and everyone, and making it easier for developers to build those values, which is where we're headed.
Reggie Hutcherson, IBM. And you mentioned something earlier about the 80s, so to speak. And when I look at it, I totally agree with the statement. But I also think that if you look at computing, it's always been about APIs, right? Performance, scaling, and so forth. I think now it's even more important because these APIs are becoming the business strategy for companies, right? So I think it's very, very much so pertinent, and it is very important. I agree totally with the statement.
Okay, my name is Brian Harrington. I'm a principal consultant at a company called CoreOS. We're a Linux operating system who challenges a lot of the thoughts about what Linux is to a lot of people. And you know, I have to be part of the crowd here and say that I completely agree with the statement. I mean, and Reggie brings up a good point. I mean, whether you're going back and looking at Corba then and thinking of it just as an API, you know, mechanism which you're semi-standardizing on, or you're going all the way out to companies like AWS, which create S3, and then hundreds of companies create products based on that API. It's being proven in the marketplace, and I think that we're only going to see it growing from here. So
what I've done before is we go down this way and then we come back this way, so you get the double up if you're on the end, and a little more time to think if you're down here. I'm going to just switch the topic real quick because I'm really intrigued by CoreOS. So there's a lot of talk about disruption. Now this morning our keynote speaker Chris Matthew talked about a poisonous octopus that can kill 26 people even though it's the size of your hand, and he called it a disruptor. And I thought, well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. CoreOS seems to me to be disrupting things a little bit, and I don't have to ask why, but if you agree with that, how? And does that have anything to do with the topic at hand of APIs?
Well, the big thing that we're doing is we're creating a Linux distro that kind of avoids the whole idea of Linux can be all things to all people. You know, we've really targeted at creating a distro that's specifically focused around not only the server workload, but the large-scale server workload. You know, we wanted to have something where when you deploy the product, you can automate everything from, everything about it, including application deployment. And that's not something that folks have had a vision of being all included up to this point. You know, you would pick your Linux, you would pick your configuration management system, you would pick a specific cloud platform, and then you would cater things to be specific to that cloud platform's APIs and all of the tooling in between. And we had a vision where in the same way that Ruby on Rails said, okay, if you abandon a lot of the kind of do-it-yourself development practices and kind of follow specific standards, you know, you use convention over configuration, then we can bring a lot of value to how you do development. And we are trying to do that same idea with the server market by saying, hey, if you specifically, you know, can abandon things like getting used to using PAM, if you can do centralized authentication in a different way, if you can standardize on deploying your applications as containers, we can provide you a lot of value in that way.
Now, with Reggie's been around with some big companies. He worked for IBM now. He was with Microsoft for a while. He was with Sun Microsystems for, I think, a long time before they were acquired by Oracle. But we'll focus on IBM right now. Also being a disruptor. You know, I'm going to write an article called In Defense of Dinosaurs, because people call the big companies dinosaurs, but dinosaurs actually didn't go extinct. They turned into birds, you know. And if you think about that, IBM seems to be one of those companies that's really trying to evolve. Sure. But there's a lot of moving parts, whether you have Bluemix, you know, Watson. I was at this event last week, and they were talking about cognitive computing. They were talking about power. And there's a lot of moving parts there. And how important is that idea within the internal or the product and solution suite of IBM, its own ecosystem? How important are APIs there? And then as well as when IBM is very intentionally connecting with other technologies. Sure. It's much more open than, say, in the past.
Sure. I think, so I've actually been at IBM for about almost 4 months now. Okay. And one of the reasons I left Microsoft and came to IBM was because I saw a huge potential for actually driving change in the industry. At the API layer, you know, if you look at Bluemix, SoftLayer, and so forth, there's a very dynamic suite of APIs and what have you. But what I saw was this combination of this idea of cognitive computing.
Yes.
Right? And regardless if you have a feel for what it is or what it's not, the idea is that, you know, driving the industry to a place where you have data and you have services that are cognitive, that are aware, that have contextual awareness and so forth, right? You may not agree with it today, but if you look at what's going on with the APIs that are just blowing up exponentially, those APIs are going to drive the platform for driving that cognitive awareness. Mm-hmm. You know, IBM sponsored an event the other night in San Francisco, mm-hmm. and it was a fashion tech show, okay. Right? It was pretty cool. So what happened is we had these designers design clothing, garments, mm-hmm. and so forth with technology in them and what have you. You can think of wearable computing, right? And just think about the data that those garments could actually collect, in addition to some cognitive awareness, such that you could be wearing a garment and the garment knows that you're going to New York in February, mm-hmm. right? So it's going to heat you up a bit, right? or if you go to Cancun, it's going to, you know, take me off or whatever it may be. Simple example, but the idea is that there's some real opportunities there, not just from a fashion or device specific, but just from the industry specific thing there. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really, really something that drew me to IBM, because they're trying to change where they were and where they're actually going. And I want to be a part of that change. Well,
and then boring down on that a little bit, you know, go back 20 or 30 years ago, and the idea of sort of this big omniscient sure. Borg was the idea of this incredibly centralized system, you know, running sort of a single OS and all that. Right. That's not how this stuff is playing out, and there's a lot of connectivity going there, I think.
Yeah, a lot of connectivity. If you actually double click and look deeper, you'll see, if you look at IBM, you'll see things changing very, very rapidly in terms of the developer space and in terms of the cloud space as well. When I worked at Microsoft, mm-hmm. we used to do hackathons and all this kind of thing. We never saw IBM. Mm-hmm. About 6 months ago, all of a sudden we started seeing IBM showing up. We say, hey, whoa, what's going on here? They're actually getting back into the game, getting some street cred and being able to engage with developers and drive innovation.
Mm-hmm. Now, Esmeralda had mentioned that she was with a smaller company with a couple hundred employees and then was acquired and now takes all the benefits of the large company perspective with 100,000 employees or more. Well, has your worldview changed? You know, when you're a smaller company, I'm sure APIs were important because you wanted to be able to have people connect with you and, you know, put stuff together into clouds and however they're doing it. But I mean, and now you're at the bigger company. Has perspective changed or no?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think all large companies are actually going through that same transformation. It's we need to be a lot more open. If you look at what's going on in the cloud, you know, a business is acquiring a cloud service from one provider, but within the organization there are, you know, tens, if not dozens of services from all these different providers. And you look at the role that needs to take place from an administration and a management of all those applications, and how do you provide that common interface? That's just in the cloud. I think all businesses are really very concerned about single vendor lock-in, and how do you avoid the tyranny of choice, which is what tends to happen in a lot of these you know, big transformations. I think if you look at IoT, all of the examples that we covered yesterday across many different verticals were ones where it was a collective group of partners that basically had to come together and interoperate, and you do that through you know, REST APIs and provide a very simple way for value to be added through developers that are able to use your APIs to build the really cool applications that ultimately add value to what you're bringing into the market.
And then Ian at Soljenia, you're working with a lot of different systems. I mean, your customers do, and you're sort of at the leading edge of gathering all this information, visualizing it, analyzing it, getting to the predictive analytics, and then beyond that, actionable. So I'm guessing that from your perspective, APIs sort of run your world or a very important part of it.
They absolutely are. Some of the instances that we've come across API usage are, I've got my analytics data, I want to put it into my CRM, then I want to use it in something else. Right. As a cloud management platform and having an API that connects to it, we see a lot of customers coming back to us and, you know, after their project's completed and ask us, hey, I need to connect something new to the cloud. How can I use your API to do that? Right. So you're seeing a lot more of that. And as the ecosystem is growing, a lot of new vendors for enterprises and our customers are creating that need for our customers to be able to connect to their existing infrastructure, their existing systems. So I've seen the trend growing, and definitely there's more emphasis on the API concept that, you know, do you guys have an API we can use? And that's a conversation that starts at an early sales cycle as well, where companies are aware of the fact that they might need access to an API to connect to tomorrow.
Doesn't everybody wish we had someone from Twitter on this panel? Anyway, if you've ever done any marketing materials, I used to write some back in my pre-reform days for $1, you know, or if you've ever read any marketing materials, from about a long time ago until now, the term seamless interoperability is my favorite marketing term because everybody's been promising that forever, and I don't know how many times I just said I'm going to hell, but I'm getting paid for it, and wrote down the term seamless interoperability. It's a dream. It's nice because it gets to the basis of the user experience and the user interface. Users really don't care about your poor little problems that are boiling underneath. And maybe not something that we can ever achieve, but is it, you know, how do you deal with that issue of making the experience to users and then to customers that are buying technology, the experiences they're providing look as, for lack of a better term, non-hiccupy as possible?
I think it really depends on the time frame or the technological time frame that you're operating in. If you're using technology from today and you're connecting to a system from a few years ago, maybe it's much more easier to connect. The problem that we're facing is that there's a rapid shift at every level within technology. So if you're talking about seamless integration with 100 different systems today, yes, it's a challenge. Maybe we'll reach there tomorrow or the day after, but then everything else would have had a few different iterations of change as well. I love the idea of having seamless integration and interoperability. That's amazing. I don't think we will ever reach a point where it will 100% click and it'll be done because the system is dynamically changing. That's the issue. There's change happening at every different level. Having said that, technologies are growing in terms of what they can do. They're able to do more in less time. Is it a great challenge or a bad challenge? I think it's a great challenge for us to, as vendors and as technology advocates, to be able to focus more on, hey, how can we make our technologies more seamless, at every different level? And I'm sure you guys are facing that within your organizations as well.
Yeah, Esmeralda?
I mean, on the user experience, I would say that prior to Ericsson acquiring Metritech, that was the single most important aspect of the product. We were a monetization software vendor, and we would be in a sales situation where you had to be able to communicate to a bunch of stakeholders ranging from the CFO, VP of Finance, to the product management marketing team, to the sales team. And the way that you did that was through the ability to showcase the application in terms of it doing something meaningful in a very user-friendly way to that particular stakeholder in the organization. And so the ability of having APIs that allow you to integrate to other components that comprise a solution, because you're not a standalone application. You have to be able to integrate to a Salesforce or to an ERP system or a RevRec platform or whatever the organization happens to have in place. And I would agree with you that I think during the sales process, we're certainly seeing customers evaluate how robust is your API architecture. They want the documentation. Because that tells them how difficult it is going to be to integrate, whether it's with another off-the-shelf product or something that they have had in their environment for a number of years.
For a while, yeah.
That's a really good question.
You're familiar with it.
And I say that because one of the largest maintenance costs for software, when you think about IT, is API interaction. Right, context switching, whatever it may be. And the bottom line is you have to have robust APIs. So you guys probably heard there was the Open API initiative was announced today, and I think it's a community effort, really. I think it's a community effort where you are exposing your APIs for developers to innovate on and actually drive success in terms of seamless integration. I don't think you get seamless integration, especially with APIs. APIs are probably going to give you 40–50% of the solution, and you have to kind of figure it out after that. But I think there's also some challenges. When you look at API, if you're going to expose APIs, right, are you exposing the right IP? Are there legal issues? Are there copyright issues? Are there security issues? So it's really important to have a foundation, I should say an API layer, that's really, really robust. And I think the Open API initiative is the type of things that will drive some of that seamlessness as we go forward.
Yeah, hold that thought on security, Brian.
So I'm happy here because for a moment I thought Reggie was about to snipe me because I was going to mention the Open API project, but my focus on it is slightly different. As an open source company and a company that is built around that type of ideology, it's been demonstrated to us over and over again that that providing open APIs that the community can collaborate on, and even more so that specifications can then be developed around, means that it becomes easier for partners, competitors, folks all across the board to develop interoperable software. And I think that by, just to take a thought experiment for a moment here, imagine, that we get to the point of having a standard ratified SDN API. Imagine what it starts to look like when an application can dynamically create a VLAN tunnel between 2 points within a network to ensure that you're going to be securing data moving through that. And I think that it's these types of standardizations that then unlock people thinking about new ways of doing things that then are going to drive kind of the better UX of applications, and more importantly, the better UX of what it looks like for at the infrastructure level. Because that's one of the areas that has been left out up to this point. And by having an easier UX process, it's going to be easier to maintain the software for longer periods of time as well, despite it changing underneath you.
Okay. Now you get a chance to answer another question when Reggie mentioned security. So I'm imagining data flows, and I'm imagining some that are by IoT where the data doesn't really belong to a person. I guess it belongs to the company, but all sorts of other personal data is flowing through these systems. And our audience here is developers and architects and operations people. So how do we reassure them about data integrity, but data security, that stuff doesn't get stolen, doesn't get lost, the compliance they have to have with people's personal information as it's wending its way through these complex, interoperable systems, and how do they reassure their customers that everything is okay?
One thing that I have
In 50 words or fewer. No.
Okay.
As much time as you need.
Encryption, abandon SSL, and X509.
Okay. Oh, you did it.
No, I mean, with emerging protocols like JSON Web Tokens and things like that, it becomes easier to have a proper handoff of encrypted data throughout a network without relying on the technology of the last century, like X509. And I think that as developers learn more of them being used well, it will kind of unlock new ways of ensuring that data can have transit over untrusted networks safely. And that's the big thing, is you need to start treating every network as untrusted.
As untrusted, yeah.
Google has a fantastic paper to read called Beyond Corp, which I highly recommend people reading because it talks about that exact idea.
But with developers, how if you have a team, are you just going to expect your people to participate in these communities and find out what's going on, or do you need some kind of formalized process or training to make sure everyone's up to speed on what's going on?
Well, for me, I've been involved within the security community for a long time, so I personally have that drive. But I try to make myself available to all with the design and development of these tools. And I think that every organization should have at least a small cabal of people who, stay well in touch with this and are able to act as both an internal Tiger team, an internal Red team, and an internal source of knowledge to be able to drive these types of discussions.
Yeah, you just go up to the C-suite and say, we need a cabal. And then here's your escort out. Well, I was right. Well, Reggie, you mentioned the topic, so...
Yeah, so a really good topic. We used to say, well, IBM has always been open source, open standards, what have you. We used to have a saying at Sun Microsystems that the smartest people in the industry don't work at Sun Microsystems, right? And what we meant by that was there are a lot of smart people out in the industry.
Except for Andy Bechtolsheim.
On a problem, more so than you can bring to bear. And with the security issue, I still go back to standards, right? If you have customers and so forth who can rely on a standard approach to solving a problem, it's gonna really drive innovation in that particular space, especially if you allow developers to actually look, because we don't even know what problems we're going to have 10 years from now.
Yeah.
But if we let developers innovate on it, and you mentioned something very important. He said, so we're not relying on security APIs and so forth of our grandfather's day, right? And that's because we had folks who innovate going forward. I just rely on standards to actually drive a lot of that. No one company, no one person has cornered the security industry and knowledge across the board. So I would rely on standards and driving it that way.
Okay. And then from Ericsson, being a telco with a lot of other stuff going on, it's got to be an issue.
Standards are near and dear to us. I would say on the security side that we have basically the same process that was described, and we have security experts, and they're there to ensure that we're doing the right thing, and they're really the voice to make that happen. On IoT, in terms of the privacy and personal data, You know, there are other industries that have had to deal with this, the financial services industries that have very specific processes, and we're now fortunate that, as we've been talking about, things have evolved from our grandfather's way of doing things. But this is not a new problem in terms of dealing with personal and privacy of data. And we now have access to technology that makes that a lot more efficient, but the processes have already been proven in many other industries, like financial services.
And then from your perspective, Ian?
I agree with everybody on the fact that, you know, there's definitely a need for standards and a definite need for, you know, a structured approach to this problem. The way I also see it is, and I was just thinking about this a few minutes ago, is akin to just like we have standards such as the ISO 9001 and the entire ISO series or any other series. Does the industry need standards that we can comply with and apply to all our organizations and departments and development practices? It's a huge challenge. But is there a need for a governing body to say, hey, all right, these organizations have a XYZ certified coding practice? The challenge that I see with that happening is that coding practices and the development of programming languages is rapidly changing and becoming better and different. So it would be difficult to kind of capture that information into a standard and say, yes, all these companies comply with it. But at the same time, do we all need a single voice that kind of captures the security aspect of things? It's a challenge. It's a challenging question. But I think definitely the way to go forward is to have a single voice in terms of accepting standard coding practices, standard API exchange documentation, or build upon in those practices. I see this as something that we constantly are going to have to work on. Develop encryption standards which are better than yesterday, because encryption standards are just as good as the weakest line of code. Anthem, Sony, we've seen a few different hacks in place. So did they not comply? I'm sure they had the highest level of security enabled. So going back to your question, Roger, how will we guarantee our end users that once their data is in our system, it is going to be governed and it is going to be protected? I believe we can hold the standards up and say, well, yes, our practices adhere to these standards, but please be aware that once your data is out there on the cloud or out there on systems that we do not touch, there's a remote possibility that it might get tempered or somebody else might get into contact with it.
You know, there were a lot of good things about the last century and millennium, I think. I remember some of them. And one of them, of course, is all the legacy IT we have. So I saw a couple of, maybe a year ago, one of the research firms came up with this term bimodal IT, which is basically, I read it kind of like is throwing in the towel management. You have the old stuff here and it's just going to stay here, and you have the new stuff over here, and that's where all the cool things are happening, and we've just given up. Well, there's enormous amounts of data that associated with legacy systems, and you have to use it. You know, how does that, so my question would be, how does the legacy technology impact this whole new API world in which we're trying to live, and how do you see your customers handle that very difficult issue? Ian, you get to start.
So, to be very honest, I see that as a roadblock for us to progress into the next phase of development. I believe that legacy systems, legacy practices are just holding us back, and a lot of companies are just sticking their heads in the sand and not accepting the fact that we've got to let legacy systems go. We've got to move on and build that rapid change and evolve and innovate so that we can move away from those practices. There's definitely some advantages to legacy systems and, you know, still using the racks and hardware-based security and software, but we're still talking about technology that's 10, 15, 20 years back. I believe we need to look 10 years ahead and think about how would it have evolved within the next 10 or 20 years. And is our past what we should hang on to, or should we be investing in the future? Now, there's definitely a financial implication to it. You can't just shut down your racks and say, I don't need it anymore. But I think we need to be more progressive and radical in terms of shunning the old practices and saying, no, this is something we need to move away from.
Esmeralda?
We deal with this issue actually on a regular basis. I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges, and it's not a matter of large organizations, particularly global enterprises or operators, not wanting to move to the new world. It's the reality of I have these services and they're on these legacy systems. I know that I am being held back in terms of innovation and new revenue streams from these new services. And often what we're asked to do is, help me with that problem. So how do you wrap those legacy data models and still be able to support all of the new services? And so that cap and grow approach is one that we're often asked about. And the reality is that the IT teams are getting the constant pressure every day from the product manager and the marketing teams that have come up with a fantastic idea. They come back to IT, and IT says, I'll get to it in 6 months. It's not that they want to say no. And so our job, particularly I think for the larger vendors that have very massive customers, it's how do you help with that transformation?
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Asia, and one of the things that I've run into over there is people say the cost of labor is still so cheap here. We don't want to change. That new stuff it costs a lot of money. They don't want to disrupt everything that entirely, and it's not an issue you see in the U.S. and North America so much, but it's pretty entrenched. Anyway, Reggie.
Yeah, I actually have two viewpoints on this. One, the legacy architecture and so forth, there's a huge switching cost to go from that to a more agile model. You just have to kind of work through that. But I also see a gold nugget there. In other words, you have these large organizations, let's pick on financial services, where they have huge amounts of data, right, and expertise, right? And I think the real nugget for them is to try to figure out how can they expose that data and create a new revenue stream. Right? So, for example, you have these large financial service companies who are trying to compete with smaller companies like a PayPal or Square or whatever it may be, right? They have so much more knowledge in the data space and data. They should somehow be able to create an API, since we're talking about APIs, a financial API or a suite of financial APIs that expose data that will give their customers an advantage and give themselves an advantage as well. I think there's a real opportunity, especially as we see APIs explode on the marketplace, for them to kind of have a powwow and kind of figure out where that's at. So on one hand, the architecture part I get, you got to kind of figure that out, brute force it or whatever it is. But I think there's some huge opportunities going forward for them in terms of API, exposing those APIs, and figuring out what's that next generation of business model going to look like, given all that legacy knowledge and expertise that they have.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, historically, this has been viewed at the C-level as a cost center. That new development is just something that you have to eat in order it's the table stakes to compete. Okay. But I think folks need to look historically at this, since they're, a lot of companies with legacy IT are already having to look to the past. I mean, don't just look 10, 15 years back. Look 30 or 40 years back. Think of what the challenge is today when you need to find the COBOL or the Fortran developer to be able to maintain that. And this is the opportunity to look at it through that lens and realize that, development is never going to stop. So you need to develop a process of evolution into your deployment and your core technological practice, and be prepared for that, and be able to consume the newer APIs and take the expertise that your company has brought to bear in the market already and figure out new ways to monetize that.
Now, once we finish, I have one more great question, I think. We'll see if it's great or not. When we're finished, we will have another presentation in this room, so we won't have time for Q&A. However, if you'd like to talk to our panelists when we're finished, please feel free to do so. If you could go out in the hallway there, please make it a mob scene. Oh, except for Esmeralda. She got mobbed the other day by about 30 people. But you can mob her again, I guess. So please feel free to talk to any of our panelists about whatever issues you have outside once we're finished. so we can proceed. Now, let's talk about mobile. I saw a presenter the other day talking about mobile containers and the need for it, and how CoreOS wasn't doing its job and Docker wasn't doing its job, and he wants all this great stuff to happen, you know. Having enormous amounts of data today. It's got to complicate the whole idea of APIs and just making things work together. I mean, what do you see, how do you see mobile affecting what we're talking about? Brian?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and I think the biggest thing that folks need to realize is that, you know, when you start getting into living in a mobile world, you now go from a scale of having to worry about, you know, tens or hundreds of endpoints hitting your APIs to thousands or millions hitting that. And it requires a completely different scale of thought about how you actually architect these systems. You have to consider things in a realm of load balancers are now just a thing you need. And that could be software, it could be hardware. That's, you know, a little bit beyond the scope. But and when you start having that many millions of devices actually reporting data back, you also need to learn how to properly use the SDKs that are available and how to really get to a stage where everything is machine automated. You know, I was talking to somebody recently who does a lot of mobile development, and they said that, well, one of our customers, they used our SDK, they ignored all the error messages that we said that we were going to respond with, and then they stopped supporting the application. But because it's a mobile application that was shipped on a large vendor's phones, it's still there, and it's still reporting back. And the only way that we were able to cope with that is by creating a state where we respond with over HTTP with a 200 code that says error back. You know, we had to manipulate our own processes just to be able to handle the scale of data coming back to us. And I think that informs where everybody is going with this.
Yeah, mobile does complicate things. Reggie?
I actually think mobile is actually driving this whole API economy. In other words, because of the explosion of the mobile data and services and so forth, you see the explosion of this, of the APIs. Because when you look at software development, developers are being pushed to be more agile, more iterative, and so forth. And so, with so much data coming through mobile, APIs allow you to do that and do it a lot faster. So when you ask the question, I think it's actually driving it. We're going to see a lot more push in terms of APIs. It was like 10,000 APIs that are open. That's amazing. And we're seeing more and more every day. So mobile is going to drive even further.
I mean, do we need to see like a wall between mobile and non-mobile, or is it just we have to look at like a different worldview then?
I think there are two things. There's one, the whole mobile space is like this thing. And then you have, you know, the IoT, and you have the other devices, that type of thing. And they're all being driven somewhat by the same thing, right? Because data is driving all of that together. So I see it as together, a fusion of the strategies, at least together when you drive them.
Obviously, my perspective, given that...
yeah, of course, yeah.
It might be a little mobile.
Yeah,
it might be a little mobile.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I mean, we are supporting 40% of the world's mobile traffic is going across our network. So I actually agree with you. I think that if you look at mobile, it's actually the driver for the creation of applications and services, because you now can connect anything and anyone anywhere. So it's really enabling companies like Uber to pop up, right? It's basically a mobile app. And, you know, you take cloud, you take, you know, mobility, and you take APIs, and you are, you know, basically bringing to market completely new business models, new companies that are very disruptive and are changing everything.
I completely agree, and just to add to what Esmeralda said, I believe that it's gone beyond the fact that mobile is an influencer to mobile is a major driver. So mobility definitely not just in the consumer space, but also within the enterprise world, where you have your business productivity tools or your CRM on your mobile device, and you're using it for mobile. So it's a completely different topic. You know, how's mobility growing? But definitely desktop computing has gone down. Mobility is increasing. Personal use, business use, and now with thousands and millions of IoT devices coming online, do we consider that part of mobility because they're out there, they're not constricted to one place, one space? That opens up an entire Pandora's box to talk about mobile. But definitely, I believe mobile is going to be a very strong force that will drive the change and the need for APIs to be available and the changes that will take place because of that.
Okay, we have about 1 minute for each of you, and we'll start with Ian. We'll let Brian have the last word. What is the biggest, and I'll put it in nice English, what is the biggest pain point that your customers have, or the biggest pain point that they're causing you in this new or this evolving API world? Ian.
For us, one of the points would be that they're unable to connect the newer systems to the old legacy systems, and because of that, they're a bit frustrated because they do want to go forward, but they're unable to do that. So the APIs are helping. They're definitely in the right direction, but that's one of the major challenges.
Okay. Esmeralda?
I would say it's both. I'll answer it from the perspective it's a challenge, but also an opportunity. What our customers are asking us is they have a plethora of different devices. If you look at IoT, and they're from different vendors and all have their own standard, and they recognize that in order to drive to more of that marketplace concept, if you think about IoT, APIs play an absolutely critical role in ensuring that you have the ability to connect all of those participants and drive real value. And there's no other way to. How do you open that up for real innovation outside of the core services that are going to be produced, whether it's a car manufacturer or someone else? At the end of the day, those periphery type of services and where the real innovation starts to happen is going to come from outside, and that needs to be very easy to do.
Just remain stubborn and keep working it, I guess. Is how you do it.
So I work with a lot of software developers, and just had the Java 1 conference last week. One of the things that kept popping up was discovery. And that is, okay, we got all these APIs. Which ones should I be using? Which ones that are most robust? How do I know unless I go and test or whatever it may be? So discovery, right? Being able to select, pick and choose, or build even in terms of that functionality.
For us, I'd say the biggest challenge for our customers is somewhat around education. They see the things that CoreOS and other companies are doing, and they really want to be able to adopt that, but they don't necessarily know how. And there's some levels of misunderstanding around it as well. So they see us flying a plane, and they, in a almost cargo cult fashion, kind of put together a plane out of some boxes and duct tape, and then they go, aha, I can do this now. I've got it. And, we have to help guide them and show them both, not only the how of what we're doing, but the why we do things specific ways. That way they understand, radical notions like why we don't want to have SSH installed even on a box period. They go, well, how do you administer that? And it becomes a challenge to truly help them understand our vision for the future and why we're taking some of these opinionated paths.
Brian Harrington with CoreOS, Reggie Hutcherson with IBM, Esmeralda Swartz with Ericsson, and Ian Kahn with Solgenia. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for listening, and again, please feel to talk to them outside the hall afterwards. Thanks again.
Thank you.